My name is Kevin Hazzard. I'm a developer work for Developer Journey LLC. It's a consulting and IT training company that I operate. You might be asking yourself, what is a C# MVP doing at a SQL conference? And that's a great question. I find that over the years I have sort of drifted toward data technologies, a lot more so than a lot of my C# peers. I have been a Windows Azure MVP in the past, and also a technical computing MVP. If anybody can explain to me what that is, we had a hard time with that one ourselves. But I really have my head in the data space, and I built a product for a client a couple of years ago. Took quite a while to build it, but the concept of the project or the product was schema change management. And over time I described it to people. Eventually I stumbled upon someone at Redgate who heard me explain this product that I built, and they said, "We're building that right now." And when that was understood and we had some conversation back and forth, they gave me the opportunity to come here today, show you what I built, or at least the concepts behind what I built for my client. And at the end of this, I'm actually going to debut a new product from Redgate, which I don't believe anybody has ever seen yet. So this is going to be the first ones to see it. So schema change is pretty tough stuff. If you work on a team that has more than just a few DBAs or developers, you find that it's a bit like herding cats. Anybody see that EDS ad from years ago where the cowboys are out herding the cats? It's one of the greatest advertisements ever created. And I thought about sticking the video in here, but I didn't have copyright to it, and we want to respect that. But you get the concept. Herding cats is pretty tough. And we can pride ourselves on the fact that we do it well, if we do it well. But it tends to be somewhat time-consuming to manage schema change across a lot of teams that are trying to keep large, complex databases in sync with one another. So typically you'll have a development environment, maybe multiple development environments, maybe every developer has their own SQL database instance, and they coalesce changes up to shared development instances. You might have QA databases, multiple flavors of those depending on circumstance and which part of the product cycle you're in. And you may have staging databases, and then of course any number of production instances. It's very difficult to keep up with all of the schema changes going on through all of those different instances and particular use cases. It's also very difficult to automate the processes related to this. And this typically has to do with organizational conventions. And so, for example, you may have an architectural review board or committee. You may have a group of DBAs that look at schema changes on a particular cycle or a particular frequency. And those organizational conventions, or mores, you might say, are something you have to think about when you're trying to automate the processes related to schema change. It's also potentially busy work, because if you say to someone, your job is to run comparison reports between these instances every day, and based on what you see, looking at some changes, for example, might be flagged as the kind that the architectural or DBA board wants to look at, and other changes might be more mundane, that don't need to be reported to someone, a higher authority, if you will. So in the cases where that happens, or on the days where that happens, you've just created busy work for that person to go through after who knows how long it takes to coalesce all the data from all the instance comparisons and then decide, hey, nobody needs to know about this. So that's a lot of busy work, potentially. And finally, it's somewhat dependent on volunteerism, I call it. In the sort of social space of an enterprise environment, you have people that sort of step up to the plate and are good at looking at schema change and deciding who needs to know about this and who doesn't. And so rather than just picking volunteers or people who just sort of naturally have an affinity for this kind of work, we look for ways to automate it instead, automate portions of it. So I'm giving you an opportunity now, if this talk doesn't sound interesting, to sort of skedaddle, as the term goes. This is the agenda. We're going to look at using SQL Compare to generate schema change reports. Some of you probably know that that exists and know how to use it, but I'll move quickly through that section. Then we're going to look at the SQL Comparison SDK, specifically on the schema side of things, to be able to scan for changes, so we can build an application in C# or Visual Basic to scan for changes, and talk about some ways that we can do big snapshotting and other kinds of facilities into that process if you want to do it. And then we're going to look at the command line, the SQL Compare command line, to actually automate the report generation. You can do really nice interactive HTML reports. And then finally at the end, I'm going to show you this new product from Redgate that nobody's ever seen before. So first things first, and I'll move quickly through this because some of you are likely to have seen this. How many people use Redgate SQL Compare to generate difference reports or schema reports? So it looks like about maybe a quarter to a third of the audience. So for the rest of you that don't do that, we'll just quickly run through, show you how you can use the SQL Compare GUI to generate comparison reports. So I'll fire up the graphical interface. And I have sort of canned some projects here. We'll compare development to QA. It says that I have 47 identical objects, so there are no changes here. Let me go ahead and introduce a change so that we can see how this will work. We'll do something simple first, like, we'll just change the size of a column from 100 characters to 200. And now we'll go back and refresh that report. Interesting. Hold on, I think I'm opening the wrong one. That's the local. I want to do dev to QA. Now these databases are in the cloud in Azure, so I have local instances I can hit if I have to. But it says I have one change, and specifically it tells me that the category has gone from 200 characters to 100. I'm sorry, on the dev side it's 200, so the QA side has not been updated yet. So within the tool, we can select this link, Generate Comparison Report. We'll generate an interactive HTML report. I'm going to put it in the SQL Compare Reports folder. Actually, let me put it up on the desktop so it's easier to find. All right. So this sort of looks like what we saw in the SQL Compare tool, but it's running in the web browser now, and it actually gives us the changes. So just like we saw in the native tool, now we have an HTML version of that we can ship to someone else. And this is pretty straightforward. It creates this file called whatever you name it. In this case, it's SQL Compare Report. We should give that a more meaningful name. And there's also a folder full of images. One of the issues that you may run into is if you're trying to publish this to a web server, you really just need to save the file structure into the right place on the web server. But a lot of times you might find it helpful to generate the HTML report and mail that to someone, or automate just mailing that HTML file. And it can be a bit problematic the way that the images are put into a separate folder. So there's actually a way you can change this. I'll show you just quickly. If you look in the file, and I've automated this with some code, but there's this function, set up images. If you delete references to this function, there's some code in here, some JavaScript, that will actually go pull all the images from Redgate site, which is kind of nice. So just a little hack that you might want to use. But then you can literally just take the HTML file and send it to someone. And as long as you can get out of the firewall, they can view it, which is pretty nice. So you may have noticed that when I went to generate the report, that among the options, not just that we can do interactive HTML, but we can also do XML for Excel and then XML. So an Excel compatible version of XML and then just sort of a raw XML schema that can be opened in a text document. I notice here there's a simple HTML, which I haven't used before. I'm assuming maybe that does the trick that I just showed with the images. No, it's something different.
It's simple.
It's simpler, okay. Oh, so it's not interactive. It's not an interactive report, so it doesn't have the nice JavaScript features. So that might be an option for you as well. That's pretty much how we do it inside the tool. And later on, I'm going to show you a way you can do this from the command line, so that if you want to write some code or batch processes to invoke it from more of a scripting environment, you can do that. All right, any questions? Any questions before we go on? I like to be interrupted, as it turns out. So if you have any questions, please just stop me. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is good. You know, being able to generate these reports is nice, but it does require some human intervention. We have to not only have the human intervention, but we've got to know that it needs to be run. So rather than being able to know, you might task someone on your team to do this every day. And that, again, can be somewhat time-consuming and can also lead to busy work that may not be necessary in some cases. They have to know when to run it, when the changes might have occurred that might be useful. So this is where sort of organizational conventions come in. If you have a team in Hyderabad that's doing some work for you, maybe we know that they deploy their changes to a shared development instance that they have access to at a certain hour of the day. So this should be run at that time or after it. Maybe there's another coalescing server somewhere, coalescing schema changes that you need to know about. Again, these are organizational conventions that you need to know about. And then finally, there's the whole distribution mechanism. Who needs to get it, right? If it involves the user-defined functions or stored procedures, that needs to go to Bruce, you know, because that's Bruce's domain. If it involves a common table expression or the use of a common table expression that uses actual recursion, someone else on the team really needs to look at that to make sure it's optimized correctly. So there's all sorts of conventions that might come in and rules that your organization might have. And it'd be good to have sort of a way to automate this. Now, in the interest of time for today, I can't show all of those things, but I'm just going to show you sort of the notions or the concepts for the tool that I built for my client using the SQL Compare SDK. So first things first, before we get going, let's, I want to point some things out to you. Here, when you install the SQL tool belt or anything that includes the SDK, you're going to have a folder, a root folder here under Program Files, Redgate, and in the SDK there's this Getting Started. Now if you're running Windows 7, I believe that there's a fairly simple way to get to it, but I've yet to find a way on Windows 8 to get to it. So you can just run this Getting Started application, and it gives you a really nice framework for knowing how the SDK is laid out, the portions that it includes. So, for example, the Compare API, the Data Compare API, Packager, and then some more examples. And then for each one of those, there are links that open up various windows that were installed as part of the SDK that give you access to bits of data or some sample files, for example. So here's a link to the API comparison website, all the help for it. And so it gives you how do you get started with it, it's basic documentation. But if you click here, it opens up a local folder for samples segregated into C# and VB specific samples. There are some great samples in here that you'll want to start with. So if you're interested, for example, in how to do snapshotting, right? Snapshotting is the idea that we can use the Redgate comparison foundation to pull schema and then create a snapshot of that schema that really can be compared like any other database. Now this is a really nice thing to be able to do as part of your change management strategy. If, for example, you want to automate the comparison of changes to also snapshot the source and target databases at the moment that you create the difference report, you can catalog those. In fact, this is what I did for my client. I not only did the comparison and then generated the differences in a consumable format, but I built snapshots for each of the databases, the source and the target, picked a particular naming convention, and then saved those off into a folder. And then over time I could go back and I could say, for this particular report that was run 10 days ago, what did those two databases look like exactly at that moment in time? Right? So I can pull those two snapshots and then compare them again myself. You may have noticed here in the tool, when we go to create a new project, we can say the source is a database and the target or the comparison is to a database. But we can also pick a snapshot or a backup or a source control source. So those snapshots are fairly easy to create with the SDK. In fact, I'll show you what that source looks like. So saving a snapshot is just a matter of creating the database object, setting the connection properties to where you want to connect to, and then calling save to disk to save a snapshot. That essentially just saves a file that you can use in that comparison process later. And then, of course, we have the load from disk function, which we can also load it rather than registering with a live instance. So this snapshotting mechanism is really that simple. Using C# or VB code, you can go in and snapshot these as part of the process. And it's something you might want to think about. If you're going to do the differencing and the automation and reporting of the differencing, is to actually capture those snapshots and just save them in a directory, barring the space constraints. Any questions about snapshotting? Yes?
Is this anything to do with the database snapshot, or is it just a schema part of it? It doesn't have any data.
In this case, it's just the schema. The question is this true of the entire database? Is it a data snapshot or a schema snapshot? These are schema snapshots, right? And so they're categorical. They're not instance data snapshots. Obviously, SQL Server has a fantastic snapshotting mechanism. Has several. Your SAN vendor might have snapshotting mechanisms for actual data, but this is strictly schema, right? The shape and structure of your database. Which, of course, when I say schema, I tend to mean stored procedures, user-defined functions, table value parameters. Those things to me are all still schema, right? They're not table shape, but they make up the shape of the database. Yes?
So what if you use the SQL data compare? Because you have both SQL compare and SQL data compare.
Yes.
So if you're using the SQL data compare, that would give you a snapshot of the data itself?
Yeah, so if you look here, the SDK is broken up into parts. And the three main parts that we see here, comparison for schema, data comparison, which is actually comparing the data, and then the packager API. So these are all things you can essentially script using C# and Visual Basic. So your question though is, can you do snapshotting with data compare? I don't know the answer to that. The answer is no. Evidently, Jonathan's telling me no. So the data comparison then evidently will, of course, let you do live data comparisons and then synchronizations, but not necessarily snapshotting. You can imagine the space constraints on that could be enormous. Right? Schema, even on a large database, is typically not that large. I mean, not that difficult to handle. Okay. Other ones that you might want to look at here. So we've got load and save a snapshot. We've got if you want to take the objects in the database and save them out as scripts. That's another really interesting functionality. Well, that's actually very simple to do with this SDK, and you could incorporate that into an overall schema management practice. But the one that we'll start with for today, and I've got a derivative of it, is compare two databases. This is just sort of a simple one that sort of leads to some natural ideas for how you can manage schema. So in this case, we'll create a database, two databases, DB1 and 2. If you think about it, in the SQL Compare GUI tool, it's sort of left and right, and they sort of draw arrows for how data is supposed to move. But internally in the SDK, they're called 1 and 2. And these, when you say how data should move, it typically will move from 1 to 2 unless you say move it from 2 to 1. And so that's just the terminology. I tend to think of it as left and right, but it's just really 1 and 2. So in the case of database 1, I have this promo dev instance, which I just added, or I just changed the length of a particular column, and I have a promo QA. And I want to do that same comparison we just did a moment ago with the GUI. I just want to do it in code now. So I was having some problems with the SQL Azure instances a moment ago. We'll see if it's up and running. So I create the database instances. I'm now going to register them. And this is where it was hanging up before. So if it hangs up, I'm going to come back to the code and just show you how this works. Of course, it worked fine until about 5 minutes before I got up on stage. Okay, so we've got some differences now. We're essentially just going to iterate through that. You can see we have a for each loop. And I'm going to say for each of the differences that exist in this DB1 versus DB2 thing that I executed, I want to find all of them where the type of difference is not equal. So equality is considered one of the difference types, which is a bit strange, but it kind of makes sense. We have equality. We have it only exists in database 1, only exists in database 2, or exists in both places, but it's different, right? So we want all of the latter three, only in 1, only in 2, or different. In which case, we're just going to write those out to the console. And we can see that between dev and QA, we have a table called DBO product, which is different. We know it's been changed in some way. So this is where you can take those organizational conventions or requirements for having people in your organization know about schema changes and put them into effect. For example, you might say, different enough is that any table changes its shape, right? Different enough is that any table value parameter changes its shape, right? Because that could have an impact on the procedures that use it, things like that. So whatever your organizational rules or constraints are, that's where you would implement that rule. For my client, I actually implemented that with a little rules engine that allowed them to write bits of code and store those bits of code in the database, and I would just execute those to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is this change substantive enough to be reported? And so I would get the difference set, run the rule set, and at the end I had a thumbs up, then I would generate the report and send it. Right?
The rules engine that you mentioned?
Yes.
That was something that you developed?
Yes. So I ended up writing a lot of rules engines for my clients. I don't know why. It's either because you know, this book that I wrote and published last year called Metaprogramming in .NET. It's just on my brain all the time or something. But rules engines are kind of, they're actually very simple to implement with something like SQL because Transact SQL is very dynamic. I can have, my client can just sort of inject bits of code to say, run this query, and if the result returns something that's not null, then it's a positive result. So in this case, we just wrote SQL, a little SQL processing engine that they could write the rules to determine which bits of schema change were important to them. We didn't, and I'll get to this when we get to the product launch at the end. Most shops don't have time to write really big, expensive rules engines or buy big, expensive rules engines and this kind of stuff. So we were looking for the way to do it the cheapest, fastest way possible, and Transact SQL just turned out to be a great way to do it. All right. So some of the other things that, and let me just look at the actual the difference computation. So here's registering the databases. That's just really calling a function in the SDK called register. So we just register that database. This is the step that really goes out and fetches all of the schema from the database and pulls it into a structure inside the program. Everything that happens beyond that point with respect to differencing and comparison is all done in memory. So once the two databases have been registered, then it's just a matter of saying DB1, compare yourself with DB2. Oh, and by the way, I happen to know that the target is a SQL Azure database. So there's some optimizations inside SQL Compare for that specific case. And of course, if they're not equal, if they're not all are equal, then go ahead and start processing. And that's where we saw pick all of those that are not of the equal type difference and report them. Now this is the point, of course, where you could save these changes out to a database. You could write them to a text file. You could create an HTML file. You could do whatever you want. Put them in XML. Actually, it's a pretty easy thing to do once you have that collection in hand. And then some other things that you might find interesting at this point. So the product I built for my client does this. There's functions like save to stream and save to disk. Save to disk is the snapshotting function we looked at. If you want to create a snapshot of all of the schema in a database, you can do that here by registering that database, which forces it to load all that schema into memory, and then calling the save to disk function. And that'll save a file out that's a snapshot that you can use later on. You can use it programmatically in your own code, or you can use it from the GUI tool. It's the same snapshotting, the same snapshot format. And I find that very valuable. So once I've generated the report, given it a specific timestamp and name, I can also save snapshots out that are based on the source and target databases, or database 1 and 2, along with a snapshot token that matches the report, and then I can always match the two up. If somebody comes back and says, look, I was going through the schema change reports, and 2 weeks ago something happened. I need to know exactly what was going on and where this came from. Right? Did this come from the team in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or did it come from the folks in Hyderabad? And so you start combing through your snapshots and your reports, and you can find those changes, where they actually came from. Another thing that is also possible, now this is where you take a leap of faith, depending on where you're at in the process. So if you're early in the cycle, from dev to QA, or from some private dev environment to a shared dev environment, you might actually want to implement the changes. So you might want to take your snapshots, generate your differences, and then if your organizational rules say, yes, go ahead, proceed with promoting this, you can actually do the deployment by doing the synchronization. And here's a bit of code. I'll uncomment this so it's easier to see. Here's a bit of code that, for example, you create what's called a work object. This is another object inside the SDK. We say build from the synchronization, build from the differences, the DB1 versus DB2. and then run a check procedure to check to see if there are any warnings, basically. This is the step, if you use SQL Compare GUI, where you get the warnings that say you may not want to actually execute this because it probably won't work. This would throw an exception in that case. And of course, if that doesn't happen, then you can just fall into the execute and let the actual execution of the synchronization go. So it will perform that synchronization step for you. So again, this is really probably not for every case, but you may have cases where you want to automate the actual synchronization step, and that's how you do it in the SDK. Any questions about that?
So the sync scope, that's out of their API. So you're
Yes.
right there, that's where you're accessing their API.
Yes, so the work object is from the SDK, from their API. Then everything off of that building from the differences that we generated earlier is there. The check function, which is, again, just checking to see that there are no warnings that are significant enough to stop the synchronization process, and then the execute. So really everything here is from their SDK.
And you didn't have to go through any wild hoops to get their SDK to work, right? It's just moving some DLLs into a...
Yeah, so the question is, you don't have to go through a lot of hoops. You know, there are quite a few assemblies. Here, if we go up and look at the assemblies, so there's the ones that you really want to have are the shared SQL assembly. You'll have to reference that one at a minimum. The utils, shared utils, you'll have to reference that one. And then the SQL Compare engine, this guy. And there are some other ones here that you may need, but those are the three. If you reference those three assemblies, you'll have, I'd say, 80% of what you need to get anything done with this SDK. Does that help?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that it's like is there a registration step in something called the GAC, right?
These are not in the GAC. These questions about the global assembly cache, or the GAC as we call it. These are not registered in the GAC as far as I know. There would essentially just be private assemblies. So once you reference them and set the copy attribute in Visual Studio, they'll come into your application as private assemblies at that point. Now, I thought you were going down the path of registration or activation of the SQL SDK or the SQL product, and yes, you need to have a license key installed for Redgate SQL Compare to make this work. It'll do that check under the covers once you've referenced these assemblies. Yes, question in the back.
Kind of on that topic, what are the licensing restrictions on this for packaging and distribution internally used throughout the whole enterprise?
So I'm not an expert in that topic, but in my experience, the question is, what are the licensing requirements for this from a Redgate licensing perspective? On the servers where my clients have had this run, they've had to have a license key on that server, on that machine that does the work. So if they bought 25 copies of SQL Toolbelt, they'd have to reserve one of those licenses to install on the server that runs this. Does that help?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. I'm hoping Jonathan will throw things at me if I say things wrong about that. All right, so that kind of gives you an overview of the SDK. Let's look at, I think that covers everything I wanted to say there. Let me do one quick check. Make sure. Yes. Yeah, we're ready to go. It's good. All right, so just to kind of tidy up there, why would you want to use the SDK? As we've sort of mentioned, finer control over execution and timing of things. There's ways to use the SQL Compare command line, which we'll look at here in a moment. where you might not have to write your own code. And that would always be preferable because less, anytime you write a line of code, you're introducing a possible problem. So Redgate has gone through a lot of time and effort to make sure that all the lines they've written and compiled work correctly. So if you can use their GUI tool as a command line tool, you can get some benefit from that. But you might find that there are certain situations where there's fine level control over execution and the timing of things that you just can't get from sort of combining their tools at the command line through batches and scripts. So, and this, for example, this goes to some of those organizational conventions or constraints that you might have to satisfy. You may have more complex rules that describes what kinds of changes do qualify for promotion. Either promotion of the schema from one environment to the other, or just the creation and promotion of a report about it. So to get those kinds of things, you might find that you get a lot more fine control over it by writing some code, a bit of code. And that is, the second bullet kind of sums that up, ensuring that changes are substantive and actionable. The other one that's kind of interesting is when you decide to run, say, a command line tool versus a service that you might have running looking for changes over time, you have the opportunity to do things like allow the database to quiesce. And quiesce, you sort of like the word quiet. When the database gets quiet, the changes have quieted down for some period of time. It might be reasonable to go ahead and run the report. We had this situation for the client I wrote the tool for whatever reason, one of the teams on another continent was trickling in their changes. We expected them to use scripts and package everything at once, but their changes trickled in every few minutes over the course of an hour or two. It's almost as if someone was sitting there executing them one by one. And what was happening is we ended up generating reports, and then 5 minutes later another one would get generated because it looked like we had two different substantive changes between the snapshots we had captured. And so with having some code around that, we were able to go in and say, well, look, if between 2 5-minute intervals we don't see any changes, or whatever the numbers are, if the database has quiesced from a schema perspective, then go ahead and generate any actionable changes at that point. And this just gives you an opportunity to let those kinds of things get out of the way. And the worst thing, the terrible thing is you go through all the work of creating something wonderful and beautiful for the team, and then you get complaints, well, I'm getting too many reports. I really just want, I would like you to have these false positive splits around a 5-minute window go away. So, yeah.
So, are you familiar with the competing product Embarcadero change management?
I have seen it. My client at the time did not want to buy it, and we implemented this actually as an alternative to that product.
Well, my question is more around, I've read the stats on that. My question is more around the only way to schedule snapshots is by using the SDK. There's nothing built into the tool to say take a snapshot every day at 3 o'clock in the morning or something as part of your change management.
From a Redgate perspective?
Correct.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's no way to do any scheduling. You would have to have your own scheduler and then put those into batches.
And then the second part of that question is the file, the .snp or whatever it creates as a snapshot, is it readable or is it proprietary format?
The snapshot file format, I believe, is proprietary, but it is compatible with the SDK and the GUI tool. So you can, if for example you needed to get it into another format, you could potentially load the snapshot and then save it out some other way, right? Just iterate through the objects in the snapshot and save, or generate. There's a save scripts. You can generate it that way. So. The thing is, and I want to not sound like too much of an apologist at this moment, but what Redgate's trying to accomplish with their tool set is not to be Embarcadero or one of these other vendors. They really come at this from the perspective of we have a top-notch comparison tool for which there's an SDK underneath of it that you can write some custom tooling if you want to. So it's not that, but we're going to look at a product at the end that maybe changes course a little bit. I don't know. Time will tell, but it'll be an interesting thing to look at. Okay, and then I'll just say lastly, just customizing the report generation process. The HTML and simple HTML options and the XML or Excel options are good, but you may have some other target for the changes. For example, you may want to pull those changes off individually and save them in rows in the database, right, as actual transactions. Right, so this schema change becomes sort of a transaction that you can query for later, which you can weave in a whole bunch of different ways. So lastly, before we take a look at the new tool, I'll just show you the comparison command line interface. And I'm going to cheat because I don't want me to type this stuff. Trust me. All right. All right, so I want to make sure the report's here. Let's go ahead and paste this command in, and I'll walk you through it and describe what it does. And in fact, let me pull it up in this note instead, and we'll zoom in on it. Okay, that's too big. Okay, we'll just walk through it like this. So the SQL Compare executable, when you run it by default, runs as a GUI tool. However, if you give it command line options, it runs as a command line tool, which is nice. In this case, I have you remember when I ran that comparison in the GUI tool? Well, that created a project which we can just reference from the command line tool. And you can also reference individual databases and users and passwords if you don't want to create a project file. But this is the project is kind of a nice way to package all these things up. So I have this promo dev versus QA SQL Compare project. I'm going to save a report to this called promo dev versus QA HTML. I want to generate an interactive report. Of course, we can pick XML or Excel. I want to report all differences. I want to force overwrites if the file there is already existing. So in this case, it's doing really the same thing the GUI tool does, but it's doing it at the command line. And the nice thing about this is you don't get just the you're not going to get just the nature of the change, but you're going to get the full reporting engine. In this case, it's telling us that the product object changed. It's the same change we saw from before. And if we go out and look at this, hold on. Here's our HTML document, and there's the report. We just generated that from the command line. Now this is nice because not only can we, as I said before, get the nature of the change, but the actual substance of the change in a report format. That can go, again, in XML or Excel format if you need it to be more programmatically accessible. Or if you need it to be human consumable, this interactive format is nice. So this allowed me to generate that from the command line, which means I can put it into a batch file and execute it that way. Or from the C# code I wrote, I could actually use the shell to execute that once I've determined that there are substantive changes and that report needs to be run. Right? So you can sort of combine the two concepts together. Make sense? Any questions? All right. I think I have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to, is that right? About 10 minutes, does that seem right? I'm going to switch gears here a bit and talk about something new from Redgate. Oh yeah, so before we do that, let me say, most organizations I've worked with lack the time and the staff and the funding, potentially one or more of those things, to do some of the things I've showed you here today. if you have people on staff that know Visual Basic or C#, and they want to dig into this, it's a really nice way to bring some concepts together. But DBAs are typically focus more on policy and performance and such, and not development of new software. So it would be nice if there were something that sort of packaged what I've showed you here today together, and that looks like this. This is a new product from Redgate called SQL Lighthouse. You can go to the website, https://sqllighthouse.com, and then there's a way that you can register now to do this. Now this currently works with Azure instances because Azure only, because it's a way for Redgate to get the tools out there in a sort of a no deployment model. And I'll show you how to go to the site and register a database. And then when changes occur, we'll be able to get emails sent to us that are basically the reports that show us what the changes are, the schema changes are. Let's take a look at this. So I have logged into SQLlighthouse.com. There's that URL you can use. And I've added this database, this Windows Azure database. I've got, you've seen me work with Promo Dev and Promo QA. I have another Promo database there that's my production database. And this is done once you add, I'll go ahead and add a database instance, or feign adding one so you can see what this looks like. So my server is here. Once I test that, you can see that I have, it's already gone out and from the Azure cloud to my Azure database, or the Windows Azure cloud to my Azure database. Seeing that I have this Promo database, and I can just click the button and say start monitoring this database for changes. Now, since I am logged in with my Redgate credentials, my email address at windowslive.com is going to receive those. So I'm not going to register another database. I don't need to do that, but I will go actually make a change. So let's just use SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to change the connection to that guy. I've created a user. This is a good idea, I've found. I've created a user in my database. I've just called it Lighthouse. You can call it anything you like, but it's the user that is going to access the data. It's the user identity. You saw me there use my WK Hazzard ID, but I would register the instance I have there as Lighthouse. So I'm gonna log in as me quickly so I can make this change. I'm going to go to the Promo database, and I'll just add some bits, some columns. That's the alarm that told me to get my kids off the bus. All right. So I add some. Now the waiting begins. So this has been kind of an interesting test. I understand that the developers at Redgate are tweaking this from time to time, but sometimes these messages come in very quickly, and other times it takes a while. So. Okay, oops, schema changes. 4 changes to my Promo database. And it looks like the employee, product, promotion, and store tables have been edited. So to get more details here, we can click on the link, and I can see specifically that change. I'm having a hard time reading this. subtype. Well, that doesn't, the change I made was I added the archive bit. But it's tagging, and this is this a bug or is this a feature?
Because of the comma.
It's the comma.
Ah, I see.
It's just doing text match.
Yeah, so it's just doing a raw text match, and the comma makes it, yeah.
Yeah, we'll work on that.
Okay, all right. But in any case, you can see how right from the email, I can go then basically log in again and dive down into the specific change. Now this isn't a single report per se, like you would get out of the reporting tools that I've showed, but it does allow you to at least get the batches of things. And we see here that all 4 of them were executed at once and sort of sensed at once. I have had times where SQL Lighthouse will, even for transactions that are less than a couple of seconds apart will send me 2 different reports. And it must just be checking spot on in between them. I'm not sure exactly why, but it's a work in progress. I've been working with it for a few weeks now, and it's it approximates a large portion of what I built for my client. It, of course, doesn't do the quiescing function that I showed you or I talked about. It doesn't implement any of the other kinds of rules, the rules engine component for knowing what's a substantive change or what's not a substantive change. But it does at least sort of connect into your database and automate the process of cataloging what the changes are and sending them to you. So it gives you sort of the capability of at least having people be notified when these changes occur. So it's a great step in the direction I think that I'd want a product like that to be going in. Questions about competing products that are out there certainly are at this point, Embarcadero and others may be a lot more mature, but this is a different kind of product concept altogether that I think deserves to be looked at in that way. So, are there any questions about SQL Lighthouse, or Jonathan, did I miss anything that I should talk about? All good?
You can actually configure the words. We haven't had as many collected, but you can set it to notify you of like creates or drops or edits or tables.
Oh yes, I didn't show that. Actually, I should. Where was it? SQL Lighthouse. So let me go back in. You can configure, as he was saying, you can configure the alerts. You can turn off the mail. So if you just want to go check the console for changes rather than having the email sent to you, you can turn that off. Store procedures, tables, and views can be managed separately from everything else from a schema object type perspective. And you can also say, I'm not interested in, I'm not interested in edits. I'm interested in creates and drops, but not edits. Right? So, as an example. Did I do that justice? Yeah, sorry, I totally forgot to put that in there. But yeah, it's a great product. If you go to SQLlighthouse.com, there's a way you can sign up for this right now for your Azure databases. So if you have Azure instances and you want to try this, it's a great way to get started. Any other questions? All right, we've been great questions from everyone, and I appreciate your letting me sort of stumble through this because I've never given this talk before. I really did it because Redgate saw the similarities with what I had built and this product that they were already well under the way developing, and thought it would be an interesting opportunity to sort of unleash it and let people know about it. So I really appreciate your time and your patience.